Style in comic books is a big deal. It's one of the many reasons why you're reading a comic book and why you're not currently standing in line to see whatever this is. She's trained for years, floundering across the floor. Comic books are popular because of this very aspect of the art form. Yes, storytelling will keep you reading, but the artistic style is the vibe that you're naturally attracted to and the real reason why you're picking up the book in the first place. Whether you're an aspiring artist or just a fan of comics, you may ask, how does one find this style you speak of? Well, in this video, we're going to learn from some of the masters of the craft that we all admire and love. To get started,
I want to play a game.
No, not that type of game. Though, if you've seen the first breakdown video I've done, you'll have some idea of where this is going. Here are 5 different popular comic book artists with their 5 different artistic styles. I've tried to condense their techniques into just a few small marks. This time I'm going to give you the artist's name. Now, can you match the artist with their style? And from there,
this is where the fun begins.
Before I give you guys the correct answers, first I'm going to need you to hit the like or the subscribe button. It will help the channel, and also it'll make these answers more accurate. From left to right, we have Dan Mora, Michael Turner, Jerome Opa, Philip Tan, finally Tradd Moore. If you managed to get some of these right, good job, bruh. Let me know in the comments if you got any of these answers right, and maybe if you thought my drawings were crap. Each artist uses lines and techniques to express the world of their imagination and in the process, flavor their art. I'm going to draw a few different objects using each of the artist's techniques and later come away with some insight on how they created their dynamic contrast. It's how I would describe the goal of whatever technique you're trying to use. If you want my full explanation of it, just go to the first breakdown video and watch it there. But in short, it means each technique's adaptive way to show light and shadow or contrast. So in no order, we're starting out with Michael Turner. The late and great Michael Turner was a 90s artist who was the protege of sorts of Marc Silvestri, famous at Top Cow. Now, Michael later broke away to fulfill his creations of Soulfire and Fathom, but his style is really this cleaner, maybe brighter version of Silvestri's obvious influence. It's very detailed. Turner's style combines exaggerated realism with heavy detail and beautifully thin lines of beauty. In other words, like these S-curves. Sharp, aggressive outer contours, but with a lot of minimal line weights. Through these drawings, my number one takeaway from Michael Turner's dynamic contrast technique, I would describe as exaggerating the intricate details in certain areas to create compositions and focus the eye. So there's a lot of ways to focus the eye. Michael pretty much used detail and the density of the detail to help the viewer find where they should look and focus the eye. It also is a good way to create shapes and compositions, but he did this really well with water and with heavy type of ornate details and wings and stuff in these creatures that he drew in his books. To round off this list, let's get into Tradd Moore's super organic stylings. Now, Tradd, who's best known for his breakout hit, The Strange Town of Luther Strode, which is great, the trilogy is awesome. It launched his career and it kind of broke him into the mainstream books as well. He drew Ghost Rider, Batman, Venom. He went on to draw Silver Surfer and some other books as well, some indies. But his style has really changed a bit over the years. It's heading further and further into the organic, almost surreal approach. His work has always had a very unique look to it, however, and I would say his organic parallel lines, his mix of stylized figure work, and his over-the-top speed lines made for a super entertaining framework for his storytelling. These days, his work incorporates even stronger, nearly perfect organic contours, and even heavier stylized approach to figures and composition. So my big takeaway from Tradd is to not draw with your pinky. That's real, guys. That's real. Okay, the real takeaway is, where many artists use lines in tricky ways to make you think that your eyes are seeing values instead of the lines themselves, Tradd embraces the opposite. Tradd says, these are lines. I know these lines are lines. You know these lines are lines. let's not pretend. Instead, he wants you to see the world the way he sees it. He wants you to look at the world made up of lines and see how beautiful this world is. So the way I would describe the takeaway is incorporate strong use of lines in your work, whether it's laying down the obvious and exaggerated speed lines of action scenes, or just laying down a grid on the floor to make space work for you better. You're drawing a comic book and it can be cartoony or exaggerated, whatever you need it to be. And you can delineate your way to your work to your heart's content, and it'll work for you. Next is Dan Mora. We've gone through a couple legends already, but Dan is a modern juggernaut of an artist. He's most known for his Power Rangers run, as well as Claws with Grant Morrison, and his extensive work at DC doing covers and a couple Batman books, Batman vs. Superman, or it's not versus, whatever. Dan's style is what I would describe as the digital technical pen look. It's where all the ink lines look like a technical pen drew them instead of maybe a brush. I know you can still get the same effect with a brush, but to me it just feels like a tech pen type of thing. It's very popular these days, but I think Dan is maybe the best at it. Its main features are a confident but loose, semi-defined rendering. It means each stroke is not perfect. He also uses dry brush textures and a heavy use of spot blacks. He also draws on top of the black with white and kind of creates these whiteout shapes, which is a great use of digital. I know what I drew here is not in pen, and in pencil you get a different effect, and for that reason, a lot of my study fell through, I think, for Dan, but I did understand what he's trying to go for through looking at his work. So let's look at some of his work here, which is amazing, of course. Now, this example of dynamic contrast, I think, is one of the most stunning ones. Dan has successfully turned the ratio itself of drawing imperfect lines versus, drawing a really on the mark line into some sort of dynamic contrast that attracts the viewer. Now, if you pay attention to his work, you'll notice that about 80 to 90% of his lines are on the mark, like very sharp, very accurate where they're supposed to go. But that last 10-20% of the line either goes through another line, it's not clean, maybe it's wavy, or maybe one of the lines just goes off a little bit. I would describe this as a little sloppy relatively, but if you use it in the right way on the page and in the correct ratio, you can turn the tables on it being a mistake and actually elevate your work in the end. You don't see the mistakes that you might call mistakes individually, but together, all of the render lines and all of the contour lines just work together into masterful, clean, and really clear work. Moving on, we have Jerome Opa. This popular artist has drawn a ton of Marvel and Image books, including Avengers, Deadpool, and the Seven to Eternity series with Remender. Jerome's style lends to a realism of the human figure, which really makes his fantastical subject matter more believable. His inks incorporate heavy spot blacks and minimal line weights, respectively, and a distinct use of super fine hatching, where in many cases it creates like a patchwork effect in the rendering. Recently, I've also seen some of his work that goes into ink wash, which is cool. The big dynamic contrast takeaway from Opa here is I've tried to use the hatch marks in the right way, and it actually led me down this road of realizing what it's really doing. If you group several hatch marks together, they count as a halftone because it's not solid black, and they can define a subject as just as well as a single black line. Another way to think about it is like he's painting. Jerome's work really feels like a full value painting because many of the lines used are indirectly shaping the contours of the subjects, and a lot of the negative space forms the figure and the subjects as well. It feels dynamic because he also uses heavy blacks and contour lines and mixes it up so the viewer never knows what he's about to see when he reads the book. It always feels like his rendering is fresh, it's never stale. Now for one of the coolest evolutions in 90s style comic art that I think we have in today's culture, the work of Philip Tan. Philip is a fantastic artist who's worked for the Big Two as well as some of the Spawn run and currently Frank Miller's Ronin 2. Looking through Philip's work, I've noticed a huge evolution on how he approaches rendering and focal points. His style incorporates this 90s rendering that's full of exaggerated figures and tons of energy. A ton of his marks are oval shapes. Even his contours tend to be open and utilizing ovals to define the subjects instead of straight lines. His recent work is a masterclass in lighting and effective cross-hatching. So my number one takeaway from Tan's work is the use of his render styles. He's dynamic, which means that he's picking the render style that works the best for certain situations. Let's look at how he renders a rounded shape. He'll first use a flat edge of the pencil to quickly give a coat of paint, if you will, to the value side of that shadow. If there's any bounce light, he'll also leave a little room of white for the bounce light. Then using ovals, he'll fill in this little fulcrum of the shadow. It's right where the light turns to the shadow. He'll kind of flick out these ovals or these heavy hash marks to give this fulcrum a darker shadow and trail into the light side of the object. Now, depending on how the dark is and how much ambient light is around it, Philip will either taper out the lines in a more thin way, or he'll use heavy ovals and kind of throw them and then hatch in a couple different directions. He also does triple hatching sometimes. That's 1, 2, 3. We talked about triple hatch in the last video. They come back again. And the McFarlane grid hatch, which I don't know who else calls it this, but it always looks like a grid to me. So it's just a straight on top view grid that kind of gives texture to background objects and gives a little bit of a difference between what the figure is and where there's grit and where there's contrast. Style is what happens when an artist has a vision for how he wants the end result to look. It can either happen naturally through an organic process, which I think most people recommend, especially the art school types, but the more purposeful, experimental sort of way to go about it is okay too. You can see somebody's style and then try to directly apply it and see if it works. You'll end up not using it all anyway because nobody likes to really copy that bad, not like directly. So you're gonna take parts of what you've experimented with and maybe slowly incorporate that into your later work. With all that out of the way, I really appreciate all the new subscribers and all of the new views that we're getting here on the channel. As you can tell, I'm a comic book artist and I really like talking about comic art. If you love comics the way I do, I really suggest you subscribing and maybe hitting the bell to find the streams that I do on Wednesday and the interviews I do on Sundays. Also, I have a comic book called Star Circuit. It's a cyberpunk racing book that I love to make personally, and it had a really successful launch, crowdfunding launch, a couple years ago, and I've been working on a big next chapter on the book. Chapter 2 is coming. If you want to see some of that book and all the art that I'm putting into it, go to starcircuitcomic.com. All the links are in the description. You can click there, sign up for Chapter 2. There's a chance to win a free book of Chapter 2. And also, you can buy Chapter 1 right now on the website. If you guys stuck around this far, I really appreciate it. You guys really help make this channel what it is. Have a good holiday, everyone. Be good.